right, if you'll take your Bible and open to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Ultimately, by the end today, we're going to talk about life and hope and all kinds of really good things because it is Easter and Jesus rose from the dead. And so we should be encouraged, but we are going to start by talking about something that is legitimately terrible, like really awful, and that is the reality of death. And, I shouldn't have to prove, I don't think, that death in general is pretty terrible. That's not something I have to do a lot of work to argue. It's a result of man's rebellion way back at the beginning. It's a judgment of God, so it's okay to call it terrible. And if you're young, I guess, or haven't seen someone die, maybe you haven't thought about it very much, but at some point you will, and when you do, it can feel overwhelming. And, I'm not as good with words as I wish I was, but there have been people throughout history who were and who describe how they felt when they came face to face with death, like Augustine. He describes how he felt at the death of his closest friend. My heart was darkened with sorrow. Whatever I looked at was death. My native place was a torment to me. My own home was a strange unhappiness. All the things we had done together became a frightful torture without him. And so it was like the lights went out inside. There's that image of things becoming dark. And everywhere he looked, he saw painful reminders. And things that were supposed to bring him comfort tormented him. And things he used to enjoy became a frightful torture. After his wife died, C.S. Lewis said he felt like life was a house of cards that had collapsed on him. He said her absence is like the sky spread over everything. In other words, he could not escape the fact that she was not there. You go outside, you can't escape the sky. It's everywhere. Her absence touched every part of his life. I was trying to think of illustrations of just how horrible it is, but I think God's given us one, honestly, in the whole process of dying. How can you look at the process of dying and say, this is natural, this is normal, this is tragic? You look at someone dying and it's a sign, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And I know, of course, it happens differently every time, but even if you think about the ideal scenario, and what's the ideal scenario? I think if you ask most people, I want to live a long time. I want a happy life, and I want to be healthy. Yeah, and yet we all know if you live long enough, at some point you're not going to be as healthy, and your body is going to slowly start breaking down. Pretty much the only way for that not to happen is for you to die young, and that's a tragedy, right? If you die young, that's another kind of tragedy. But say you live a long time. This philosopher named Seneca, he put it so well. He said, little by little the body decays, the senses grow dull, the steps falter, but death does not take us all at once. He kills us in pieces. And that last phrase is so striking. He kills us in pieces. And the Bible recognizes that. Long before Seneca, the writer of Ecclesiastes, gave a vivid description of aging and dying. He says, Ecclesiastes 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain, in the days when the keepers of the house tremble, your hands shake, and the strong men are bent, your legs become weak, and the grinders cease because they are few, you've lost your teeth, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, your eyesight is failing, and the doors on the street are shut, your ears have become deaf. From a certain perspective, it can look a little like torture, those final days. I mean, here you were, this strong person, and you could do this, and you could do that, and you could go here, and you could go there, but now you're not even able to leave a small room. And sometimes not even get off your bed. And everyone's out there living their life, doing their thing, and you're in that room, and you're probably going to spend a lot of the day by yourself, almost like solitary confinement. And you're not doing much, but still you've got a lot of pain. You've developed these painful sores on your body just from lying there for so long. That can make it difficult for you even to sit up without moaning and groaning. Imagine. And sometimes your mind doesn't work as well as it used to. It gets foggy and you become confused more easily and things become frightening. Sometimes you lose touch with reality and you have people telling you what to do, and sometimes you're not even allowed to make your own decisions anymore about really basic stuff like, where am I going to live? Or what can I do today? And even if in the past you were respected and people listened to you and had to do what you said, the time comes when many of those same people treat you like you're a child. And I don't want to go on anymore. I know it's awful. Or at least it can seem awful if we think about it. And so I guess it's not surprising that honestly, a pretty strong temptation, we face a pretty strong temptation not to think about it. I think that's what a lot of people do. They distract themselves with busyness, pleasure, and ambition. Pascal, he said, we're like prisoners on death row who know death is coming. And every day it's like we're watching others be sent off to their execution. It's horrifying. And yet, most people really don't want to think about it. He said, being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. Which I suppose would make a talk like this feel pretty awkward. But if you come to church for very long, you're going to hear a lot of talks like this, because the Bible's approach to death and even the trials that go along with it is very different. We're supposed to think about it. Our own death, first of all. The Bible even teaches us to pray that we would know the reality of death. There's a number of Psalms where the psalmist actually prays, "O Lord, make me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am." And the death of the wicked as well. Our own death and the death of the wicked, which is a really, really hard thing to think about. But if you've been at Cornerstone the past few months, you know that Jesus talks about the death of the wicked. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he gives a description of a man as he's experiencing judgment, which is supposed to be a warning. He's like, look at this, see this, because it's helpful. And we might get angry at God about the warning, but the warning is supposed to be helpful if you're not there yet. We need to think about death, our death, the death of the wicked. And in 1 Thessalonians, this chapter we're going to look at today, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul says we need to think about the death of believers as well, how we process other believers dying. He says, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep." And that's like a thesis statement right there at the start. It tells us what this passage is about. That's the subject. We don't want you to be uninformed. We want you to be informed. We don't think it's good for you not to know. You need to know about those who are asleep, which might sound funny if this is your first time reading the Bible. You might wonder what he's talking about. Why would I need to know about people who are asleep? But he tells us as we keep reading this passage what he's talking about exactly. If you look at verse 15, he makes a contrast. He says at the beginning, "For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive," and we know what that means, of course, "we who are alive will not proceed." And now this is the end of the verse. I took you to the end of the verse. "Those who are alive will not precede those who have fallen asleep." And so fallen asleep is the opposite of being physically alive right now. In other words, I don't want you to be uninformed about those who have fallen asleep. He's talking about someone who's dead. And we can make it more specific than that, because he clarifies in the next verse at the very end, verse 16, he says, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And so it's not just anyone who's dead here, it's the dead in Christ, which is a cool way of talking about it. But he's talking about believers who have died. And there are other passages we could look at to talk about unbelievers who have died, the dead outside of Christ. But here he's specific. He says he doesn't want us to be uninformed about what happens to believers who have died. And it's not just like information he's giving us here. If you look at the end of verse 13, there's a reason he gives. He wants to persuade. So this is not a lecture. He says, we don't want you to be uninformed so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. And grief, of course, is not just something intellectual that happens in your mind. If you're grieving, it's something you feel deeply. And here, Paul is saying he wants us to think about what happens to Christians who have died because he wants us to grieve differently, think and feel differently about death than people who are not Christians, which I think is kind of shocking if you hear that, like you're hearing it for the first time. If you just stop and think about how terrible death is, how painful death is. And honestly, it's a little bit of a problem. It needs an answer, a solution. Because while I know we're kind of used to that statement, you have to admit it's a little stunning that Paul would write believers and say, you know, one thing that I want you to instruct you about that we really think is important you know is what happens after believers die, because there is a right way to feel and a wrong way to feel about that. There's a right response and a wrong response to someone dying. And that right there is what got me thinking about this passage, honestly, a lot. As I'm talking to my mom every week, and I hear my dad in the background in pain, anguish, dying. And of course, you know, we don't want to say more than he's saying here, because he doesn't say, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve. End of sentence. No, it's so that you will not grieve as others do who have no hope. And so we're supposed to grieve. There is grief in death. And to act like there isn't any is strange for a lot of reasons. Thomas Aquinas once said, it is natural that man should grieve for the death of a friend, because death is naturally feared and resented as being destructive of life, which all naturally love. Wherefore the separation caused by death cannot be a matter of joy, but is naturally a cause of sorrow. And you hear that word natural, because what he means is that if we look back at the original design, we were not made for death. Death entered the world through sin. It's a consequence of evil, and that's part of why we dread it. I don't know that animals dread death in the same way as humans do. Maybe in the moment they're frightened, but not that deep down dread. There's something uniquely human about dreading death, because we have a certain knowledge and awareness that other beings don't, and we know that being alive physically is something good. Life is a gift, we say that, and we're talking about physical life. Even this body, and not just my body, our bodies are designed by God, and so when someone dies, they lose that good for at least a little while. They're separated from their physical body, and it's natural to grieve over the loss of that good. In Ephesians 5, Paul says that no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it. And he doesn't say that's wrong. He just assumes that's normal and good and natural. He says no man, not just no believer. Humans nourish and cherish their bodies. There must be something in how God made us to do that, because it's good. And so if you see someone who has something good stolen from them, you should grieve over that with them. And physical life is a good thing. And I know, of course, there's more that we need to say about that. But if we love someone, grief honors the love we have for them. Even Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. He gives us a picture of how to respond. And he weeps, not because he thinks he's losing Lazarus forever, but losing something important to you, even for a short amount of time, is unsettling. I lose my wallet, I'm bothered. I lose a limb, that would be painful. My house burns down, there's some sorrow there. How much more a dear friend? Grief over death, and maybe even more so, grief over the whole process of dying is an expression of mercy, actually. We're sharing in sorrow and being burdened by another's suffering through grieving. And so Paul's not calling on us to be cold or heartless about death. And he's not expecting that feeling correctly is going to be easy necessarily either. That's why he's writing. You don't become a Christian and then bang, you know how to grieve right. You don't need any instruction. He begins verse 13 by saying, this is why I'm writing, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have not hope. And Paul had been with them and told them a lot of things already. Down in chapter 5, verse 1, he says, now concerning the times and seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. And he's talking about the end times there, which we think of as really sort of complicated instruction. And so it's strange that he says they needed to know about this because it seems kind of basic, people rising from the dead. But he thinks they need to be informed. And it's either that they're so focused on the return of Christ that they were getting confused about people dying. There are a lot of people who think that's what's going on. They just expected Jesus to come back, and so they didn't think much about what would happen to people who died before he did. And I guess that's possible. Or it could just be that death is so hard, that this is a nice way of Paul reminding them to remember what they knew. Paul does use this same language other places to tell people something they definitely already knew. And if we look at the end of this passage, we see he assumes that even though he's writing this here, they're still going to need to hear this again, because verse 18, what does he say? And this is the only command in the passage, so it's important. He says, therefore, encourage one another with these words. Like, okay, I'm doing this right now. I'm writing these words to encourage you. And part of the reason is because I know you're going to need encouragement in the future. And so I'm giving you the kind of words you're going to need to say to each other when you start to forget this, because he knows death is really, really hard. And it's normal to grieve. And it's tempting in the middle of all that grief to become overwhelmed and to start to grieve in a wrong way, like everybody else. And so he's like, let me help you here. Because this is important, clearly. It's important Christians grieve differently, feel differently about death. Important enough for Paul to write about. There's information that should change how we feel, and God cares about how we're supposed to feel. This is something he commands us to keep encouraging one another about, to help each other, in other words, feel correctly about when we're tempted not to. That's why this passage is here. When you look at the first verse and the last verse, it tells you what Paul's wanting to do. And I want to say that here at the beginning, because if you know this passage at all and you're a person who studies the Bible a lot, you know this passage is one where people go to talk about some of the details of what happens at the end, and even whether there's something called a rapture or not. And of course, there's stuff to think about here when it comes to that for sure. But the thing is, that's not really what Paul's primarily wanting to do in this passage. And we know that because he tells us what he's wanting to do. I want to inform you so that you may not grieve as others do. I want to give you words to use so that you can encourage one another. And so I just want to focus on that because it's big enough. What does Paul say here that could possibly change the way we think and feel about something as terrible as death? Because it's got to be really significant, right? It's got to be really significant for Paul not to just be cruel. And even just to change what seems natural, these reasons have to be super solid, substantial. And if we think about what he says in the passage for a while, there's quite a number. Like, for example, let's just start with the fact that Paul says, we do not want you to be uninformed. And I was going to try to give you 10 reasons here, but I think we'll only get 6. So you'll have to find the other 4 for yourself. But Paul's main argument is verses 14 to 17. And we know that because he says for at the beginning. Like, that was my subject and my purpose. And now here's my reasoning, for. But I'm going back before we get to that, because I don't want to miss some of the assumptions that he makes in verse 13 either. Like this first one. We do not want you to be uninformed. Because what does that statement assume? It assumes that you can be informed. Otherwise, Paul couldn't say it. He's saying this is not a desirable position to be in, to be ignorant about what happens after someone dies. And so I'm going to take action and I'm going to inform you, which is amazing. Like if we read the Bible, like we hadn't read it before. That is an amazing thing to say. If you think about anybody else telling you that, I see that you don't know what happens after death. Oh, that's too bad. So I'm going to tell you what happens after a believer dies, because it's not good for you not to know. That would be amazing, right? If someone looked us in the eyes and said that to us with confidence. And I'm not sure we always feel that when we read this, actually. And it's maybe because there's so much crazy stuff out there. The articles you see on your news feed. Person back from the dead explains what afterlife is like. We get skeptical. That feels like clickbait. Or maybe it's because we hear so many words about it that we know are not based on substance. People say stuff all the time, like, they're in a better place. And so often, the person saying it doesn't know what he's talking about. They could be coming from the bar drunk, just finding out that someone died, and say that to you. People hear someone died and they're like, well, I guess heaven gained another angel today. And you're like, but angels and humans are like different species. How's that possible? Or they say, they'll always be with you in your heart. And you're like, what are they doing in there? How'd they get in there? And of course, they're just trying to be nice, but we know they don't know. And so it's just air in our ears. It doesn't carry much impact. But we can't put Paul in that same category. He's different. And of course, this is an article of faith for us as Christians, but we've got reasons for believing Paul's not just speaking for Paul, and that he's actually speaking for God when he says this. And so when you're struggling with grief, one important thing to remember, to remind yourself, to hold on to, is that God has told us what happens. We can know. We're not ignorant. While death is scary, and we might wish that we didn't have to go through it, we need to appreciate how kind God's been and what God has done for us. Because while he hasn't taken death away, he's gotten us ready by giving us specific information about what's going to happen. People call death the great unknown. And sometimes that's supposed to be an encouragement. Like, we don't know what happens next, but it could be something good. But we do know. Death is not the great unknown. Death is the great known, actually. We know the most important stuff. Not everything, but the most important stuff. And when we start to get afraid or discouraged, we kind of have to hold on to what we know, because how fear and discouragement work is they try to get you to question what you know, which is pretty easy to do when it comes to what the Bible says about death, because it's such a strong fear and it's such a deep grief. And we need to keep remembering we know what we know. You've probably had to do that when you've gone into surgery, if you've ever had surgery. You're like, why am I here? Okay, this is what the doctor told me I was supposed to do. This is what the doctor told me was going to happen. This is what comes next. This is what it's for. And this is not a doctor. This is God who informs us about what happens after death. That's reason number one. We know what happens after death. And what we know takes a lot of the fear out of it, which is reason number two. It actually changes the whole way we think about death. And you see that in the language Paul uses for it in verse 13, because he gives another word to use for death. Instead of death, he uses another word. He says, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. And I showed you earlier how that means who have died. But he doesn't say died here. He says sleep. And it's a little bit of a strange way to talk about death, actually, because most of us know that being dead and asleep are pretty different. You walk into a room and you see someone laying on the floor, and I say he's sleeping, you react one way, and I say he's dead, and you do something different. In fact, we can come at it from the other angle too. You walk into a room and you think someone's dead. You see there's a dead person there. And your emotions are probably affected, right? Unless you're a doctor who's like made for this moment or something. The rest of us, we see somebody we think is dead. Your pulse goes up. You start to freak out. And then suddenly you find out, no, he's not dead. He's just sleeping. And what do? You've got this peace all of a sudden. Or at least slowly but surely your pulse rate starts beating quite as quickly and your emotions actually change. And Paul calls death sleep here. And not just as a polite way of talking either. Like, I don't want to say the word died. That just seems so tough. It sounds so intense. So I'm just going to say sleep to make it sound nicer. And we know he doesn't do that here because in Thessalonians, Paul uses the word died in the very next verse. He says, verse 14, for since we believe that Jesus died. And so when he talks about Jesus, he uses the word died because he doesn't have a problem with that word. Maybe because Jesus rose. And so he's like, okay, I'll call it death now. But since these other people haven't, he won't use that word because he wants to remind us that death is not the end for them or for us, like it wasn't the end for Jesus. And he actually got this way of speaking about death from Jesus. That's how he spoke of it too. You remember how he said his friend Lazarus had fallen asleep and he was going to awaken him? And his disciples were like, oh, I thought he died. And Jesus is like, guys, he did die. I just think of death differently. And I'll use that word because we use that word, but that's not what's really going on here. And that's partly why it makes sense to grieve differently. Because look, if death meant that your body went into the ground and you were done with it forever, if that's what death meant, you lost your body forever, it would be super sad. Not because you would be gone, because you wouldn't be gone, but because you would be losing a really important part of you. You're not just a body. You're made up of two parts, body and soul. And so when you die, your body goes into the ground, but your soul keeps on ticking. And yet, if that's the way it was going to be forever, there would be a reason to grieve, because as humans, your soul and your body are meant to be together. And this is one of the things that's different about us, actually, than angels. Angels just have this spirit and no body. And it's something that's different about us than animals, too, because animals don't have the same kind of souls that we do, and so they're just a body. And so an animal dies and his body decays and he's in trouble. He's gone. Even if an animal were raised up and given a new body later, because a new body is going to be a new animal. And so even if it looks the same, it's going to be more like a clone, I guess, of the original, because he doesn't have the same soul. It's not the original. All an animal has is the body. But humans have these two parts that are actually separate, and yet are so vitally connected that it's like the body wants to keep clinging on to the soul as long as it can. And the soul doesn't necessarily want to be apart from the body either, because it feels unnatural, like being unclothed. And actually is unnatural because it's not how humans were designed. We're not angels. We're humans. And so if death was death and meant the soul was going to be separate from the body forever, there would be some reasons to grieve there, serious reasons. But we know it's not. Instead, you die, and it's more like your body goes to sleep for a period of time, while your soul is separated from your body and stays very much awake, like more awake than it's ever been. When he talks about death as falling asleep, it's your body that's sleeping, not your soul. Which is why Jesus can tell the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. And why there's a sense in which Paul can actually say he desires to die, because he knows his soul is going to depart and be with Christ. And what's it departing? He's leaving his physical body for a little while. That's what he means there. And that's the part that makes it hard, actually, and why there's even a question, because ultimately your body and your soul were meant to be together. And that's why we can grieve some. But we don't have to be overwhelmed by grief, because we know something about what happens after we die. Our souls go to be with Jesus, and our bodies are laid in the ground, but not forever. It's not really death. It's just that they're going to sleep there for a little while. And then they'll wake up. 3, and we're still getting to the big one. We're not even where Paul starts making his argument yet. But the wrong attitude about death can be such a problem that we're trying to get all the reasons we can. And this third reason comes from the end of this verse. He says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope." And you can see at the end there how Paul identifies who he's talking to by contrasting them with others. And he's making such an important distinction here that we need to notice it, because it's like he's dividing the world up into 2 groups: those who have hope and those who do not, which is a little bit of a surprising way to divide up the world, actually, because unbelievers do sometimes seem to have hope, right? Paul says, you're part of the people who have hope, and he's talking to Christians. And all those people out there who are not believers don't have hope. But I think if you talk to most unbelievers, you find there actually is something they're hoping in. And yet Paul says they have no hope. And so how does he say that? He says that because he's not just talking about the attitude here. He's talking about what the attitude is based on. And so there's this attitude you're hoping, and then there is what you're hoping in, the hope. And some hope is true hope. You're hoping in an actual hope. And some hope is false hope. It's no hope. And so unbelievers can feel like they have hope even though they don't. Like Eve, when she took that fruit in the garden, she was hoping, this is going to be amazing. It's life. But she had no hope. It was a lie, death. And there are a lot of people like that out there, going around acting super confident with no reason to be confident. But believers are in a completely different space because they have hope. And so, of course, they can feel like they don't have hope, but the reality is, if you're born again, you have something in the future mind-blowingly good that God is going to do for you through Jesus. And here, Paul's probably thinking the return of Jesus primarily, because that's what he's going to talk about in the next verse. And that's part of what we need to be contemplating as we're grieving, honestly. Jesus is going to return, and he's going to fix everything. And we need to keep going back to our hope and putting our hope in it, because, of course, at the moment, as someone is dying and we're grieving, and that can be super God-honoring, because that's a way of saying, God, I agree with you that death is not a good thing, that sin is awful, that it brought this into our world, and so we cry and we're sad. But as we're doing that, we don't just give ourselves over to that grief, because at some point we have to step back and remember there's something different about us. We're not like people who don't have hope. We have hope. We know how the story is going to end. So I was thinking it's kind of like coming home one day and seeing all these people up on the roof of your house, and they're taking the roof down. And all these other people banging away, knocking the walls of your house down. And if you didn't know what was going on and got out of your car and saw that, you would be freaking out, right? Like, what are you doing? That's my house. But what if you knew your father was concerned about your house and there were some problems that needed to be fixed? And so he told you he was sending this incredible construction crew to do what needed to be done so the house could be restored. Your response would be different. You have information then that would change your perspective and even how you feel. And if it didn't, we might be like, bro, we know it's sad to see your house like that. You lived there a long time, I get it, but you know why? And you know what's going to happen, right? And so let's get it, together a little and make sure that we don't complain like someone who has no idea where this is going. And we know where this is going. Of course, we do not like our bodies breaking down. And we don't like seeing people we love and their bodies breaking down. It's terrible. Dying is a hard process. But we know where this is going. We're not like everyone else in this world. And so we kind of have to grab hold of what we know and apply it to our emotions. We have hope. And so we need to hope. 4, and now we're finally getting to the reasons proper that Paul's given, not just the assumptions that we're making. But he says, verse 14, for since we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And you can tell we're supposed to keep reading there because that's the first half of a statement. Since implies you're going to give a conclusion to this. Don't grieve as those without hope, for since you believe this. Like what? But first, I just want to call out that word believe before we go there, because he didn't have to put it in for the sentence to make sense. He could have just said, for since Jesus died and rose again, and the whole sentence would have still worked. So how does adding this help with grief? I think maybe it helps us understand the process of what needs to happen to grieve differently. Because say we're in a situation and we're responding, and it's so painful, that response can feel like it's the only possible response. But we have to look at it and ask, wait, what does it actually reveal about what we believe? Because our emotions and our thoughts should flow out of what we really believe. And they do, actually, but sometimes we got to work at it. Like maybe if you're scared of flying, you believe that it's safe to fly, you really do, but it's hard to believe when you're getting on the plane or there's turbulence. And so you have to go back and remind yourself, this is what's real. This is what's real. Or like maybe children are a good example too, because I know when Marta has to take a call and goes into another room, Jericho, our son, who's only 2, starts to get upset and cry. And so I have to go down there and pick him up and remind him what's true. Mom's in the other room, buddy. She's like literally right away across the door there. She's talking to somebody on the phone. She's coming back. And it takes work sometimes. I can't just say that. It takes work to get him believing that again and his emotions in line with that, which is kind of what Paul's doing for us actually. For since we believe, like, I know this is painful, but this is what's real. Let's go back to that. And what is it? What do we believe? This can be number 5 because he takes us back to something that is basically the fundamental thing we believe and sets us apart as actually being Christians. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And I'm still not quite where Paul is going yet, but this is foundational because in another place Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We're even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ whom he did not raise. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. And so this is not like a minor doctrine. In other words, this is absolutely essential to everything we are about as Christians. And it's like a fact. It's an event. And so Paul doesn't start with a philosophy or a way of thinking, which I could imagine might be like a more Buddhist way of dealing with the fear of death. I don't know. It's dangerous to talk about stuff you don't know much about. But I would imagine, like, you're afraid. Let me give you some thoughts or insight that can help. And there's definitely approaches like that. But you need to notice this is different. Because Paul's saying we grieve differently because of a historical event. You're a soldier in a prison camp, and someone says, be hopeful, buddy, because that's what's going to get us through this. We just got to keep hoping. And that's different than somebody saying, be hopeful because I just got news, our side won. And that's how Paul's comforting us here. Jesus died, but he didn't stay dead. 3 days later, he rose again. And we could do some work trying to prove that right now, and maybe someday we will. And if you want to be encouraged, there are like lots of books on evidences for the resurrection. And some of them, the books that the people who wrote those books started out non-Christians, and they became followers of Jesus as a result of what they learned. But I actually want to do something a little more simple instead, because I know, like, this is big to talk about grieving differently over death, because death seems so scary, I think of it like a monster who's staying right outside this village we're all living, and day after day we see person after person leave the village, go out and fight this monster, and never come back. And so if you're a villager and it's your turn to go out there, and I'm trying to encourage you when no one's defeated the monster before and come back to tell us, it's going to be pretty difficult, especially if I'm just giving you a motivational speech. Like maybe they didn't come back because they found something better out there. But that's not what we're saying about death for sure. We're saying someone has gone out there to fight that monster, and he's come back. Jesus went out to face the monster, and he won. He died, he rose, and he came back to tell us about it. And I wonder if you ever thought about why he rose when he did. Of course, we know the plan was for him to die and rise 3 days later, which is long enough to prove that he really was dead. And so that part makes sense. But I wonder if you ever thought, why 3 days exactly? Because technically, I think it could have been longer. And I'm just thinking out loud here. But I think as long as his body rose, that's what's important. And so the plan could have been for his soul to go to heaven and his body to rise at the end when everyone else's did. I guess it would have been hard for him to descend from heaven then. That's probably part of it. But I think maybe another reason God had Jesus die and then rise again 3 days later is for your encouragement. Because if I tell you we're going to defeat death, you might be like, yeah, sure, but nobody has. And if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead yet, if he hadn't come back, I would be like, well, God says Jesus is going to rise, and you would need to believe that. But God's been so kind because he doesn't just tell us to believe or hope. He gives us this huge proof. First, Jesus comes and says all these things, and then he goes in there and he battles our greatest enemy that no one's defeated, and he wins, and he rises from the dead, and he comes back, and that changes everything. I was thinking, it's Tim Keller maybe, as he was dying, this pastor who once said, you know, if Jesus rose from the dead, if he really died and 3 days later got up again, you have to accept everything else that he said. Somebody rises from the dead, you need to listen to what he said. And if you do accept everything else he said, then you know what? You know, everything's going to be all right in the end. We're going to be okay. Because he didn't just die and rise again for himself. And this is reason number 6. And now we're really at the heart of what Paul's saying. But still, we got to work a little because he doesn't quite say it the way he does some other places. He says, for since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. And even so means in this manner, in this way. And so Jesus dying and rising again is like the model for what he's going to say next. We believe that Jesus died and rose, and in this manner, in this way, through Jesus, and the ESV is the only version I could find that translates it like that. So let me give you a little different version that I think is better. He says, even so, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. And so that takes the through Jesus and puts it at the end. Fallen asleep through Jesus or in Jesus, which is what he's talking about. He's talking about Christians who have died, fallen asleep in Jesus. And he's looking forward to the future and saying, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. And he's talking about what God's going to do when Jesus returns. And he's saying that God will bring people who died in Jesus with him then. Which maybe at first kind of sounds like he's saying what? What's the picture that comes into your mind when you read that? Sort of sounds like he's saying, since we believe Jesus died and rose again, God's going to bring all these souls back from heaven with Jesus when he returns. But we have to look at that a little more closely, because if that's what he meant, that would be a really strange second half of this verse. Since we believe Jesus died and rose again, first part of the verse, in the same manner, even so, and what do you expect him to say next? Second part of the verse, about those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. You expect him to say that they would rise from the dead too. And I think he is actually, that's the point. I don't think when he says bring with him here, he's talking about bringing their souls back from heaven, but instead their bodies up from the grave. And you know, if you wonder, you can see that more clearly if you look down, because he starts explaining in verse 15 and 16 what he means exactly. And he says in verse 15, for, which means this is the first part of his argument. I'm going to prove that God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. And how am I going to prove that? By giving you some revelation. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord. So this is not opinion. Jesus told us this. And what did Jesus tell him? That we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. And so that right there tells you what he's talking about. We're here alive, and Jesus comes back. But other believers died before he did. And so what is going to happen? Paul says, we're not going to precede them. Which is a weird thing to say if in verse 14 he means that Jesus is coming from heaven and all these souls are coming with him. Because if he's talking about their souls coming from heaven primarily here, then it sounds like they already preceded us. And so what's the point of him saying the same thing again? Why would he have to encourage us? Don't worry, you're not going to precede them because we would be like, I know I'm not going to precede them because you literally just told me their souls are coming from heaven with Jesus, so how could I precede them? But if we keep going, verse 16 shows us that's not what he's talking about at all, because he says, for again, and this is an explanation of what he just said this time. We know we're not going to precede them, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Will rise first. In other words, we won't precede them because they're going to rise first. And what's he talking about? He's talking about the resurrection of the dead. And he's given a pretty long explanation how it's going to happen exactly, but basically he's just saying that if Jesus died and rose again, those who have fallen asleep in Jesus, the dead in Christ, their bodies will rise too. Just as, in the same manner, Jesus died and rose again. Because Jesus' resurrection and ours are tied together. If the one happened, the other's going to happen too. Guaranteed. Because we are in him. And when you become a Christian, you are united to Christ. And that union is so deep that even when you die in Christ. You are dead in Christ. And death doesn't break the bond you have with him. And so your soul goes right to be with him, of course, but that's not where it ends because he rose. And so you will too. And so at an appointed time, Jesus is going to come back. And Paul talks about how glorious it's going to be in verse 16. He gives a picture. He's going to descend from heaven with a cry of command. And that's got to be military terminology, right? With the voice of an archangel. I'm not sure what that means, actually, unless it just means angels are coming with him and they're crying out like soldiers might as the generals leading them into battle. And with the sound of the trumpet of God. It sounds funny to speak of God as having a trumpet, but we're getting a picture here of Jesus coming back with authority. And if you are one of the ones who has died, when he does, your body's going to wake up and be transformed to be like his glorious body first. And then verse 17, we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up. And there's your word for rapture. But without getting lost in the details of that, let's stay focused on how Paul's encouraging us, because there's a lot of encouragement here if we'll grab hold of it. And we need to grab hold of it. Because look, this is not theory. Like, I love you, and you are going to come face to face with death sometime. With someone dying. Not like hypothetical. This is real. And you can try to distract yourself. That's the way you could try to deal with it, by like filling your life up with stuff like going to Disneyland and watching TikTok videos all the time and just swiping so you never have to think. But that's just trying to solve your problem by denying reality. You're not living in touch with reality. And the gospel gives a much better solution than just close your eyes and numb yourself to what's real. And appreciating that solution begins with recognizing the Bible's telling you the truth, and that dread you feel deep down about death, that fear, makes sense because death is not normal, which is why you're so bothered by it. That dread is a clue. We have fallen. Something's gone wrong here, and we're not the way that we're supposed to be. But good news, God's provided a real solution, which is why we're here celebrating. And if you're a Christian, you know that solution, which is why it's so important that you do not feel about death and dying the exact same way as everyone else does. Because right now, we're the only group of people on the planet, the one group who actually has hope. That's real. We have the gospel, and we know the gospel changes the way we think about death. And it's not just a matter of us wishing really hard that's the way it was. It's based on this historical fact. Jesus died and rose again. And when you believe in him, God unites you with Jesus, which means that his death is your death. He died to take our punishment so you could be forgiven. And he came back to life and rose. Why? So that you could rise again. And what does Paul say? End of verse 17. So you could rise again, meet him in the air, and always be with the Lord from that point on, forever. Which, of course, is the ultimate reason here for grieving differently. The fact that the day's coming and we're going to be with Jesus forever. But that reality is only going to comfort us and produce joy in us if we know Jesus and love Jesus and want to be with Jesus. And so as I close, I want to challenge you. Death is coming. No matter how hard you run, you can't outrun death. Death is coming. Your death and the death of others. And it is hard. It is hard. But it doesn't have to be terrible. The process might be painful. But by God's grace, you can prepare for it so that you can face it differently than people without hope do. And here's the absolute key. You have to go back to what you know. You have to remember what death actually is. You have to think about who you are. You have to remember that you have hope. Remind yourself of what you believe. Enjoy the resurrection. Apply it to your life. This is what the resurrection means for us. And by faith, here it is. By faith, you have to learn to look forward and desire being with Christ more than anything else in this world. Because that's the hope of heaven. And I'm telling you, one day, if your dreams come true and you live to be so old and you're sitting in that room by yourself, hurting and aching, that is going to be the only thing that can bring you joy. And if it's going to bring you joy then, it's got to start now. You got to start enjoying Jesus and his glory as much as you possibly can now. Don't wait. And so I'm going to pray as we close here. And I just want to give you a moment to look at your heart and think about the way you think about death. Like, how are you responding? Do you have any desire in there to be with Jesus? Is there any desire to be with Jesus? If you ever go to a wedding and the groom is standing up here and the bride's at the back and she's just weeping, like crying uncontrollably. And she's like holding on to the door, like her finger or her knuckles are white. She's like, and like crying out like in agony. And she's like hugging her dad. She's like, Dad, please no, please no, please no. You're like, this is awkward, this is weird. Something is wrong here. And yet that's the way many Christians seem to be. And it's strange. It's strange to the world for sure. Like, what kind of hope is this? And so if you don't desire to be with Jesus, ask yourself, why not? Is it because I've just gone to church a long time and I don't know him? And ask him, go to him and ask him, Lord, I need to know you clearly. Change me. Or is it just because you filled your life up with so many small things